Genesis 2:24 says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." 1 plus 1 equals 1. 1 plus 1 does not equal 2. The two will become one, and something new is formed at the point of marriage. And it's formed in the sense that there is a new family formed. But when children come into the world, there is something absolutely new there, a new human being who has never existed before, who will live for eternity. Something absolutely new. So this is what we see in Genesis 2:24, but Paul picks up on this theme in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 30 through 32. "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church."
Being a provider and being a leader of my home. So that simple thing raises our wives to be who they are called to be, because they feel secure in who we are as men.
So the marriage of a man and a woman is a profound mystery. And part of that mystery is what marriage reveals to the world about Christ and his church. We live in a broken world, and in that broken world, sexual deviancy is normal. Adultery is too often normative. Marriages ending in divorce. Men and women simply living together. Sex is seen as recreational or a form of entertainment. Homosexuality and pedophilia are increasingly normal. Lesbianism, bestiality, and now the flourishing of transgender and the coming of post-binary culture. All of these things are part of our broken world. The world has been waiting for the love story of God, for the love story of God to be completed, so that we may fully understand the glory of God's intention for marriage. Marriage is the foreshadow. It's found in God's faithful love to Israel and Christ's self-sacrificing headship of the church. There's a relationship between the pattern of marriage that was established in Genesis and God's history as Ish of Israel and Christ's headship of the church. And all of this points to the marriage at the end of time. The scriptures begin with a wedding and end with a wedding. They begin with a woman and end with a woman. So in this world where we see such broken relationships between men and women, and we really, deviancy is normal in the world. And we have this wonderful picture in the scriptures of what marriage is and what God intends for our human marriages to point to the coming marriage of Christ and his bride. Ephesians 5:22 through 23, here's where we find this pattern of marriage. It refers back to the creation when Paul describes the marriage pattern. The creation order of one man and one woman in marriage is a profound and mysterious thing. And this profound and mysterious thing points to the glorious and eternal marriage of the Son of God to his bride. So we live in a broken world, and we see the brokenness and fragmentation of human lives and of relationships. And yet, in some way, as we strive to take seriously the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman, as we seek in some small way to manifest a godly marriage, we are indeed pointing towards the marriage that will come at the end of history. Christ is the loving servant head of the church, so the husband is to be the loving, serving head of his wife. And as the church is the loving, respectful help to Christ, so is the wife to be the loving, respectful help to her own husband. We find as we study this passage in Ephesians that it begins not in Ephesians 5:22, but in Ephesians 5:21. Now, in most Bibles, there is a break between Ephesians 5:21 and 5:22. So you look at Ephesians 5:21 here, and then you start over again and look at Ephesians 5:22 here. But these are not to be separated. Ephesians 5:21 says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. We are brothers and sisters in Christ. We are brothers and sisters in our humanity. And we are to submit to one another as brothers and sisters. So, submitting is something we do as human beings, one with another. Has nothing to do with a male's stature or a female's stature. It's the human thing to think of the other first, to submit to the other first. And so Paul actually begins this pattern for marriage with the concept of mutual submission of brothers and sisters before marriage. Michael Cravens, who is the vice president of the National Coalition for the Protection of Children and Families, has said this: marriage is the first earthly relationship that we enter which requires us to shift the focus of our lives from ourselves to others. It is inherently other-centered. We grow up focusing on ourselves, and particularly in the Western world, we have almost a narcissistic obsession with ourselves. We love ourselves to that level that we just focus on me, me, me. And when you live for me, 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 and then you get married, if you continue to live for me, 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 you will not stay married very long. Marriage is the first earthly relationship that we enter which requires us to shift the focus of our lives from ourselves to others. In function, as we read Ephesians 5:22 through 30, we will find that Paul addresses both the wife and the husband, but he has a different message for each. So while we are equally human, equally valuable, equally in our diversity of equal importance, and part of this we see we are to submit ourselves to one another equally as human beings within the marriage relationship, there is diversity. And there is a role for the husband and a role for the wife. I've been a pastor. I was a student pastor at the university, so I have been involved in marriage counseling, pre-marriage counseling, and Ephesians 5 is something I would draw on for both marriage counseling and pre-marriage counseling. And I was always intrigued when I said, let's read Ephesians 5 by what the man listened to and by what the woman listened to. And it didn't take me long, especially where I was working with a husband and wife who were struggling, where I'd read the passage and the wife would say, you see, you're to love me. And the man would listen to the passage and he would say, you see, you are to submit to me. And it'd be very clear that you weren't listening, they weren't listening to the part of the text that was directed to them. They were listening to the part of the text that was meant for the other. So it took me a while to figure this out. And I finally started saying, okay, now we're going to read this text. And I would start by reading the passage for the man. And I'd say to the man, this is for you. And I'd look at the woman and I'd say, you're not to listen to this. This passage is not for you. And then we'd turn it around and I would read the first part of the text and I'd say to the man, this is not for you. You're not to listen to this. This is for your wife or the woman who you are betrothed to. And that helped a little bit because I think people took that seriously and that made them focus on the part of the text that was for them. So we'll start here with the diversity focused on the husband because I think this is probably the harder of the two texts. John Piper said, therefore, headship is not a right to command and control. It's a responsibility to love like Christ, to lay down your life for your wife in servant leadership. Headship is the divine calling of a husband to take primary responsibility for Christ-like servant leadership, protection, and provision in the home. The husband does not need to know that he is the head of his wife. And so when it says the husband is the head of his wife, that part of the text is addressed to the woman, not to the man. The man doesn't need to know that. What he needs to know is the how of the headship. How is a man to be the head of his wife? So the husband does not need to hear that he is the head of the wife. He needs to hear how he is to be the head. The man is not the head of all women. He is the head of only one woman, his wife. And how is the husband the head? Verse 23, as Christ is. Verse 25, just as Christ. Verse 28, in the same way. Verse 29, just as Christ does. The pattern for a man's headship is Jesus Christ's headship of the church. While the word head means a position of authority, the nature of that authority is defined by Christ's example, not by sexist culture. The word headship is a word for authority. But the pattern is built on relationship. The relationship between God and Israel. And as we have seen in this series, we looked at how Israel rebelled against God, prostituted herself before other gods, and what did God, Ish, do? He continued to love. He continued to serve. He continued to give himself to his bride who had become adulterous. And it's the pattern of Christ to his church. It's the pattern of the head to the body. It's the pattern of the husband towards his wife. And the operative word in this text is love. If you look at this text, you will find the word love 6 times. Twice in verse 25, 3 times in verse 28, and once in verse 33. How is the husband to be the head of his wife? As Christ is the head of the church. And what did that headship mean? He loved her. Just as love is the bond of the Trinity, just as self-sacrificing love is what binds the 3 persons of the Trinity together, it is that same love, self-sacrificing love, that binds the 2 people in a marriage together. So the word that appears here 6 times is the word agape. It's not eros. Eros is intimate sexual love. Is there to be intimacy, sexual intimacy within marriage? Of course, and it is to be enjoyed and celebrated. It's one of the greatest gifts that God has given us as human beings. But that's not the love that's being described here. It's not phileo love, the love of friends. My wife is my best friend. I love her. I phileo her. So yes, just as there is eros in the relationship between a husband and wife, there is phileo. But that's not the word that's here. It's agape. And agape love is self-sacrificing love. You sacrifice yourself for the other. You think more of the other than you think of yourself. The exact opposite of what our cultures teach us. It's about me. It's about me. I'm right. You're wrong. No. The other is the one who is to be served. And this is what defines headship. It's agape love. This is the love that sent Christ to the cross. He thought more of me than of his own life. He thought more of you than of his own life. It is this love that the husband is to exhibit in his marriage towards his wife. C.S. Lewis wrote a profound book called The Four Loves. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it because he unpacks the 4 words that are translated love in the New Testament. And here he's talking about agape love. And I remember the first time I read this passage, it both thrilled me and shocked me and challenged me. This headship, then, is most fully embodied not in the husband we should all wish to be, but in him whose marriage is most like a crucifixion, whose wife receives most and gives least, is most unworthy of him, is in her own mere nature least lovable. For the church has no beauty but what the bridegroom gives her. He does not find, but makes her lovely. And this is what we saw in Hosea. This is the love that Hosea had. Because Hosea's wife was least lovely. She was a prostitute, and she kept prostituting herself despite the self-sacrificing of her husband, Hosea. And ultimately, he went to the slave market and bought her back. Headship, then, is most fully embodied not in the husband we should all wish to be, but in him whose marriage is most like a crucifixion. It's in that moment of the difficulties that we face as couples. What do we do? And the husband is to love his wife at that moment, the way Hosea loved Gomer, the way Ish loved Israel, the way Christ loved the church, is most unworthy of him. Christ in the slave market paid the price for his bride. He paid the price for his bride, and that is why we can be his bride, because he bought us from the slave market of sin. It's Hosea and Gomer where he bought her back because she had sold herself to someone. It is sanctifying love. The husband is to think more of his wife than he does of himself. This is Philippians 2, 3 through 4. It means, as we see in Ephesians 5, 26 and 27, it means a love that sanctifies. It's a love that creates a space for his bride to flourish, to become all that she is intended to be. It's a love that means to feed and care for. Verse 29. Is the husband the head of his wife? Yes. What does that mean? It's not the sexist concept of headship. It's self-sacrificing headship. Giving all that you are to your wife. Now we look at the first part of the passage, Ephesians 5, 22 through 24. Diverse roles, equal in being, and the roles are different but equally important for the making of the whole. Equally important for the making of the whole. So the wife is to be loving and respectful helper of her husband. And again, do not apply a sexist mentality to this. And submission, this is John Piper again, submission is not slavish or coerced or cowering. That is not the way Christ wants the church to respond to his leadership. He wants it to be free and willing and glad and refining and strengthening. Submission is the divine calling of a wife to honor and affirm her husband's leadership and help carry it through according to her gifts, for her to use her gifts to be the easer, as God is easer. God is my helper. God is your helper. He is easer. And the wife is called to be the easer of her husband. There is the word submit here, and we've talked in this series about how submission in the modern world is a dirty term. Submission in the Bible is not a dirty word. It's the Greek word hupotasso, and it's found 3 times in these verses, just like the word love is found in the passages that deal with the man. This word is found here in relationship to the wife. And it is often translated, submit yourself. And this reflects the willing submission. It's not a coerced submission. The wife, who is a free moral agent, submits herself willfully, puts herself in submission to her husband. The model for this wife is found in Mary's attitude and free volition when she says to the angel Gabriel, "I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said. May it be to me according to your will." It is the voluntary submission. And then it says in verse 22, and this is incredibly important to see, unto your own husband. You are not called to submit to somebody else's husband. You are not called to submit to all men because you are a woman. You are called to submit to your own husband. Men are not the head of all women. This is a sexist idea. But the man is the head of his wife, and we have seen what the nature of that headship is. It's not tyranny. It's not tyranny over the wife, and it's not tyranny over all women because they're women. There is none of that. The wife is to submit to her husband just as she would to Jesus Christ. And here we can see this as both motivation and imitation. She is motivated by Christ. She is to submit to her husband. And in the same way she submits to Christ, she submits to her own husband. So, as to the Lord is seen for both motivation and imitation. And we find here there is a symmetry between the husband's call and the wife's call. The husband loves his wife. How? As Christ loves the church. And the wife submits to her husband. How? As the church submits to Christ. And then it says, in everything. And this is a very simple Greek word. It's pas. We find it in the Great Commission, all nations, pas, all nations, pas, all that I have commanded. It's a very simple word. And it means all or all things. But this does not mean the wife is to disobey God in order to obey her husband. her final authority is with God. And it does not preclude the wife from thinking and from asking questions. Too often, many of us don't think, men and women don't think. In fact, there's an anti-intellectual climate. No, we should think. God has given us minds. And He's given women minds to use, to think, to ask questions, to reason. And it does not mean that the husband can lord it over his wife. She is not his property or his inferior. She is his equal. So again, we need to abandon the sexist mentality as we read this passage. And it does not mean that she is to be imprisoned in her home barefoot and pregnant, which is so often how people see the woman, the wife. You stay home. You're here to have kids. You're here to take care of me. No, this is not the concept that is portrayed here. She is to respect, she is to have reverence for, to venerate, to treat with deference her husband. He is her loving, self-sacrificing head. Do we revere Jesus Christ for what He has done? Yes. We're grateful, we're thankful. And in the same way, wives are to respect their husbands. The wife is to proactively respect her own husband. Is this always easy? No. Sometimes men are real jerks. Often we think more of ourselves than we do of our wives. But just as the husband is called to sacrifice himself for his wife, to think more of her than he does of himself, the wife is to respect her husband. Dr. Susan Faw is a theologian, and she has written a wonderful book called Women and the Word of God. And she says this, and this will be the conclusion of this session. God commands concerning marriage involve self-denial for both husband and wife, but of different sorts. The wife's submission establishes the God-ordained headship of her husband, and the husband's love ensures the wife's best interest, her treatment as a person. Each one's obedience helps the other to fulfill his or her duty. We think of the other first. And this is the mark that separates us from our pagan world, our sexist world, our feminist world. The sexist world, the feminist world, who's at the center? Me. But in the Trinitarian order, the Trinitarian paradigm, who's at the center? The other. And the relationship that ensures the bond is love. Self-sacrificing love. So men and women are equal. They are equal in marriage, but they have different roles, different responsibilities. And those roles and responsibilities are towards the other, not towards the self. Marriage is a mystery. I have a good friend who's a pastor, was my pastor for 10 years. He's a psychologist, had a counseling practice for years, taught university for years, pastored a church for years, and he met his wife when he was 4 years old and she was 3. They grew up together, went to the same school. When they became adults, they got married, and they're in their 80s now. So they've known each other for almost 80 years. And Pastor Ramon said to me one day, you know, Daryl, I'm going to write a book someday. And I know the title, The Stranger in My Bed. He's known his wife since he was 4 years old. And they're deeply in love, but there's still a mystery. Celebrate the mystery, because this mystery points to the end of history and the coming of Jesus Christ for his bride.